Well, thank you for joining us for another Friday Leonard Peikoff lectures. These are just getting better every week. Thank you so much. We had an incredible number of people watched the essay, The Analytic Synthetic Dichotomy, and our discussion of that. Such an important essay sounds very abstract. By the time we were done with it, and we could tell this from the great comments in the chat,
Yeah.
everybody came along for the ride. This week, an easy essay. And from a book that I have to give a quick story about. So we run an objectives group in Southeast Michigan. Some great people in the group, really wicked smart. One of the guys, super smart, indignant about what? About this book, The Early Ayn Rand. He said, I don't think that book should have been published. Ayn Rand didn't want that stuff released. And I kind of get it. I understood why he had that perspective, but Leonard Peikoff explains he went through the same process.
Yes.
Do I really want to release this material? And he explains why he did it in several places in the book, but especially in an essay that he put at the beginning of the excerpts, the unpublished bits from the Fountainhead, the editor's preface. Before the book came out, it was published in the June 1984 edition of the Objectivist Forum. It was added to the early Ayn Rand. He called the essay Ayn Rand's Literary Style. There it is, the original right there. And that is what we're going to talk about today. We will make some surprising connections between this essay and our previous discussions, but just in and of itself, oh my gosh, is this good. As always, the man behind the show, the man who knows far more than I'll ever forget about Ayn Rand and objectivism is here. James Valliant, how are you doing today?
I am quite well, my brother. I am. How are you? And I have to say that you put yourself at far too low a spot in relation to me. We're equals, my brother.
Well,
Your insights.
I'll accept that.
You, your insights inform me, sir, all the time. So you
I'll
are
accept that only because in objectivism we don't regard humility as a virtue. So I'll take
right.
that one. Thank you.
I would not say this to just anybody, sir. By no means. You're absolutely right in your first observation. Even in this essay, Dr. Peikoff talks about how this really wouldn't have fit in to the character of Howard Rourke. It's really not consistent with, at the end of the day, the Howard Rourke she created in 1941 and 42. This is her early attempts at trying to get at it, and so he explains why Ayn Rand cut it out. Now, on the other hand, Ayn Rand preserved this material. Unlike her character, Henry Cameron, who had all of his old designs and drawings burnt when he died, she actually preserved them and gave them to Leonard Peikoff, her heir, with the thought, you make the judgment call as to what should come out. And here we see in the early Ayn Rand, if I could just back up for the whole book and give an ad, what we see here is Ayn Rand's intellectual and literary development as an artist. She came to this country in 1926, barely speaking English, and yet 10, 15 years later, she is a master of the novel as a style, a master of English, American English, as a language to use. And when I first read The Fountainhead, I had no idea that it was written by someone from Russia, for whom English was very much a third or fourth language. So I have to say that Ayn Rand was a human being just like the rest of us. She did not spring from the head of Zeus like Athena, fully armed. And noting this development, this progress in her quality of writing, she was a devoted craftsman to her task, to her craft. And watching that development is itself absolutely instructive. So much of Ayn Rand's philosophy she developed from the process of fiction writing itself. And that's what makes that book so valuable. And this essay is an important part of that.
I could not agree more. Of course, I would never be so presumptuous as to disagree with Dr. Peikoff anyway when he writes that despite my misgivings, I could not convince myself to leave this material hidden for a single reason. It is too well written. And it absolutely is. It's really magnificent.
Some of the most beautiful writing in American English you will ever find, both in The Fountainhead as it's published, but really even in these excerpts. Such beautiful writing. Now consider the ruthlessness of Ayn Rand as an editor. No I'm repeating this sort of thing with Peter Keating and Gail Wynand anyway, so it's kind of superfluous. Secondly, it's not exactly the Howard Rourke I want to project. So even though it contains some of my best writing, I'm going to cut all these big sections out and leave them on the floor. Wow, what a ruthless editor she was. In this sense, she was not narcissistically wedded to her own words. She was committed to the project itself and communicating it as clearly and effectively as possible and as beautifully as possible.
Yes. Now, jumping forward a bit, Dr. Peikoff points out something central to Ayn Rand's writing, something unique about her literary style. Now, last week we talked about the analytic-synthetic dichotomy, the false separation of concretes and abstractions throughout the history of philosophy, and especially leading up to the 1960s and what that did to the culture. This week, we're talking about writing. We're talking about Ayn Rand's literary style. And yet it turns out there's a connection there. In fact, it's the entire theme carries forward.
Profound, profound. Now, get this. When Ayn Rand wrote The Fountainhead, she had not explicitly fully worked out her theory of concepts. She had not fully worked out her complete answer to things like the analytic synthetic or necessary contingent dichotomy. And yet you can still see that mental method implicitly at work throughout her early fiction, especially by the time she gets to The Fountainhead. Here she's utterly perfected a unique style that combines both the abstract and the concrete in such a unique way. You'll recall in that earlier discussion, the problem was philosophers had artificially separated concepts from their full meaning, from their concrete meaning, unable to recognize the relationship between a universal and all of the concretes and their attributes that they actually integrate and contain. They regard definitions as arbitrary or as definitions as intrinsic, and in that way they just separate words from their actual meaning all the time. And in the process they separate fact from value. They separate the analytic and the synthetic, the necessary from the contingent. And in every way you can imagine, Ayn Rand is trying to cut through that stylistically. So she has this remarkable capacity for doing what I can't see really in any other novelist that I've ever known. She will explain more consistently her abstraction in terms of a simple concrete description. If she can explain the abstract concretely, she will do it. If she can explain the abstract concrete, other way around. If an abstraction is an abstraction, it's got to be concretized. If it's a concrete, it can't just sit there. I've got to explain its integrated meaning in this context. She describes her abstractions in concrete terms, her concretes in abstract terms. And so this constant shifting back gives the reader this experience of, well, what is this? I know that the telephone rang. What does that mean? My gosh, it demands of you, the reader, to connect it to all the other events and ideas, whereas she's saying something about money not being evil in a Francisco speech. Well, that forces you to connect it with all the concretes that she's already laid out in the novel. She's forcing you, in effect, as the reader, to consider the abstract through the concrete and the concrete through the abstract. That is the leitmotif of Ayn Rand's literary style.
You're right that she does force you to do that. She takes you there, and that's the only place you end up. And yet, at the same time, force implies effort. By the time she takes you there, she has done all of the work for you. Let me tell you one moment.
Most of that effort, right?
Yeah. Well, Bonnie in the chat says that YouTube started a little late, so she may have missed it. Where is the essay found? Bonnie and anybody else catching us a little bit late here, the early Ayn Rand contains the final published version. The essay was originally published in the June of 1984 of the Objectivist Forum. There, James has the original one there. I've just got the anthology. It's all in there. But if you've got a copy of the early Ayn Rand handy, it is the opening essay to the excerpts from The Fountainhead, the unpublished excerpts. And yes, James, Ayn Rand takes us exactly where she wants us to go. But as we suggested earlier, she does the work for you. She does all of the heavy lifting. And again, by giving you not just, oh, you should feel this way, or, oh, here are the specific things you should examine, but those concretes, which then bring you to one layer of abstraction. And as Leonard points out in the examples that he gives, then take you through, well, here's what you might glean from that, then give you concretes that give you the broader abstraction. So you're right, she takes you exactly where she wants you to go. And
Exactly.
by the time you get there, it seems perfectly natural.
Yes, exactly. With Ayn Rand, it's not as though, in fact, her stories often contain mysteries. Atlas Shrugged is a giant mystery story in one sense. And it's not as though there are questions she wants you to figure out on your own. In The Fountainhead, like Howard Rourke, we're trying to figure out the principle of the Dean. So there is a mystery, there is a question that she's trying to leave open and for you to do the figuring out on. But all of the pieces that lead you there, she does all the work for us. So that step by step, oh, I can see that is a reflection of that. I see this is a reflection of that. And then suddenly when you're done and she really poses the question, right? You do it on your own, and it's your own mental work that finally does it. It's an amazing, she's stressed always as a writer that the task of an artist, of a fiction writer, is not pedagogical. It's for the emotional experience. It's for contemplating something, in effect, for its own sake. And so, on the other hand, she is a genius teacher in the course of it. She will pose a mystery, a question that she wants you to figure out on your own, but she will give you all of the tools you need. And she'll, in effect, spoon feed them to you in the most delightful way by showing you the integration of the concrete to the abstraction. Because in her mind, the two always work together.
It's interesting. There was a point that both Leonard Peikoff and Harry Binswanger have made in talking to Ayn Rand when she went to writing nonfiction in the 60s and the 70s with the Objectivist newsletter and then the Objectivist and then her own personal Ayn Rand letter. She told them that sometimes writing these articles, this nonfiction was easy. It was often,
she thought it much easier than doing fiction writing. She thought writing novels or plays was way more difficult than writing a nonfiction essay about some topic of the day. Or
4 years to write The Fountainhead, 12 years to write Atlas Shrugged. But what's fascinating, in the light of, as Dr. Leonard Peikoff explains, she was already doing philosophy when she was writing, because her style was to integrate concretes into abstractions and to integrate abstractions into meaning, which is fascinating. Her definition of plot as a purposeful progression of logically connected events leading to the resolution of a climax. Her very literary style was philosophical. Now add to that, say, Galt's speech, in which case she worked out an entire philosophy, not just her own personal philosophy, but a broad universal philosophy, answering some questions that some philosophers had never figured out. I guess it isn't a big wonder that it took 12 years to write Atlas Shrugged. And yet, when she went to do Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, it was almost already there in her pen.
Exactly. A remarkable thing about Ayn Rand, even when she describes, for example, her discovery in the 1940s of measurement, omission, and unit economy being the basis of concepts, was a discovery she made in the 1940s. It really, when you think about that, but by the time she gets around to writing it, it just flows out just like that. It was I am sure that was the hardest thing maybe she ever nonfiction had to write. And yet for her, even that was in effect introspection. I'm just looking inward and telling you how my mind works, how I figure out problems, how I write novels, how I think about my philosophy and integrating it. It's in effect looking into how she forms concepts, how she develops her own thinking about human motivation or theory of knowledge or theory of psychology. She's expressing those ideas in concrete terms in such a way that the writer or the reader cannot but grasp exactly that. But in effect, her philosophy is an expression of her own methodology as a writer.
Yes. I started with a criticism a friend of mine had made with regard to the release of the early Ayn Rand. Another criticism that sometimes comes out Ayn Rand wrote at the end of Atlas Shrugged, when people ask me about my personal life. It's essentially the prologue to it. To my novels is my life, and I mean it is the expression she used, and I mean it. And some critics have said, well, but Ayn Rand, didn't you get some help from your family in Chicago? I never asked for help and I never received it. Or didn't you know, they'll try to find these gotchas.
Gotchas.
I think they they have no idea, no clue how deeply that idea, and I mean it, runs. The fact that she wrote the way that she thought, and then she later explained her philosophy of life and developed it in the way that she thought. She actually means it.
She means it. The Dagny Taggart, she said in her private notes for the novel, is me with any possible flaws removed. Dominique she described as Dominique, me in a bad mood. And she said of We the Living, that is the most autobiographical book I will ever write, even though the main female character, Kira, is an engineer and she wanted to be a writer. They're both very similar young ladies in Russia in the same context. And in effect, she is telling you about herself. And when you look at her heroes, she is in effect telling you about her husband in a way. She said in her letters more than once, my heroes will always be reflections of Frank. So
Yes.
What's fascinating to me is that she conceptualized and clarified herself and her husband in a consistent way. A character in a novel has to be a purified, consistent thing, but it is totally based on her own experience, her own reality, and what she valued in herself and other people, in fact.
Yes. I love of course, she used references in real life. And you know better than I do some of the specific characters who show up in her novels. Well, Ellsworth Twigg wasn't actually that person, but it was a starting point to what kind of person would that be? Oh, okay, well, let me put Mencken in the novel and let me put Hayek in the novel, and they're nothing like people in real life.
With Ellsworth Toohey, it was clear, it was Lasky, the founder of the British Labour Party, whom she heard give a talk in New York once, or Lewis Mumford, the architectural critic who wrote all those big books about how architects contribute nothing original. We're all part of a collective creative process. She had to work those dudes. She could see that those dudes, people like that, were in effect what she was talking about. So Ellsworth Toohey is sort of an abstraction of those public intellectuals, just as, in effect, her heroes are also abstractions, and those who are in a learning arc are abstractions from herself and those that she actually knows. She's talking about reality in an abstract way, but then putting it back into concrete terms, and concrete terms, those concretes, inevitably reveal and get you to see the abstract reality she's getting at. Utterly unique in the history of literature, as far as I'm concerned.
Yes, it goes as far as, well, could there ever really have been a costume party where architects dress up as their best buildings? Actually happened. Newspaper's article on it.
If it didn't really happen, you'd think, oh, well, she's making up something silly, right?
Yeah, she's so disconnected. She's so unreal.
Ayn Rand took, and this goes back to, talk about concrete reality. Ayn Rand, to prepare for Atlas Shrugged, actually inspected steel mills, foundries. She actually learned how to drive the engine of a locomotive. When she was preparing to, she talked to an enormous number of businessmen. When she was preparing for the Fountainhead, you can see in her library when she died, she had an enormous number of books on the history of architecture, theory of architecture, biographies of great architects, including multiple biographies of Frank Lloyd Wright. She worked in an architect's office, actually. She actually worked in a leading New York architect's office for a while before she even took pen to paper. And of course, We the Living is based, in effect, on her own experiences in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution. And so Ayn Rand was very much, romantic realism, this combination is the only real way to understand, and it reflects, in effect, is what we said at the beginning, the analytic-synthetic dichotomy. She's penetrated through that. To her, this is reality as it could be, it might be, and it really ought to be.
Yes.
This is a purified form based on the facts of reality that could be. So for her, she acknowledged other genre. She absolutely, for example, in Anthem, she uses quite a different genre than is normal for her novels. On the other hand, her real home, the place where she could really fully use this integrated method of concept and value, was with a novel that talked about real people in their real careers, with their real love lives here in contemporary America. And she sort of places it there because that is what she wants you to be able to see through those kind of events, her ideas, and those ideas reflected in these kind of events. Romantic realism was really the only way she could add of integrating fact and value, the abstract and the concrete.
Just so, I had mentioned at one point that one of my quirks, personal quirk, Robert Nasir kind of thing, I don't swear a lot. I don't tell a lot of really rude or dark jokes, but when I do, they're really funny. Or when I use profanity, that I mean it because I hold back. Profanity shouldn't be wasted. It should be saved for the bedroom and the battlefield. And my point is that I think dark humor has to pay the freight. If you're going to use that kind of humor or going to use that kind of language, you need to make it worth it. Similar to, dark music, depressing or melancholy music, it needs to pay the freight. And the amazing thing about reading Ayn Rand, we talked about how in every scene and every example given, we may read a couple of them, but read that section of the early Ayn Rand. She gives you the concretes of the situation. She doesn't tell you how to feel. She tells you, here's what happened. She gives you one layer up of abstraction. Here's what it added up to in this moment. Right. And then she gives you more of the concretes. Well, here's more of what explains that next level. And by the time she gets to the end, sums it up with a statement of the meaning of that scene. She's paid the freight. And she's gotten you where she wanted you to go. And as Leonard Peikoff writes, let me find it real quick here, it comes perfectly naturally. Because of her method, she can make words convey at the same time the reality of a given event, its meaning, and its feeling. And the reader experiences the material as a surge of power that reaches him at all levels, reaches his senses and his mind and his emotions. And then he goes on. This is the best part. Although Ayn Rand's writing is thoroughly conscious, it is not self-conscious. It is natural, economic, flowing. It does not strike one as literary pyrotechnics, although it is that. Like all great literature, it strikes one as a simple statement of the inevitable. And that is what I think some people miss if they try to bulldoze through her writing, usually because all they want to do is criticize it, is if you just read everything that's there, you don't have to work to get where Ayn Rand wants you to go. She's an expert guide at getting you exactly where she wants to go, precisely because of the literary method that Leonard Peikoff talks about here.
It's so funny the way Peikoff describes it and the way you describe it. She'll give you the concretes. She will not tell you how to feel about them. But those concrete, somehow wait a minute, I've got this sense of unease. There's something I've got there. I want a reaction to it. So I'm already starting to build that reaction. She then gets to that next layer. By the time you get to that next layer, you're already sort of feeling it. And she's simply naming the feeling that she sort of nudged you by pure fact to get to. But then by the time she gets there, she's got to go back around to reality again, give you the concretes to get you to the next level. It's this shuttling. We've discussed this so many times in our epistemology courses on Sundays with Leonard Peikoff, this shuttling back and forth between the abstract and the concrete. And as I say, getting you to see the abstract and the concretes and getting you to see the concretes were just reflections of the abstract is a very, very difficult skill. And you don't even notice Ayn Rand doing it. That's how good she is. And so at the end of the day, I've given Ayn Rand writing to people, and at the end of the day, they'll say, I started out hating Howard Rourke. What an SOB. What a cruel monster he is. And then somehow, by the time I'm in the middle of the book, I'm now questioning myself. Maybe, Ellsworth Toohey isn't the good guy. Maybe Howard Rourke is the good guy. More than one person has conveyed that experience to me. And that is a testament to Ayn Rand's power. She's laid out to you the concretes and wants you to draw those evaluations, but she does such a skillful job that the sensitive reader can't help but finally get it, so that when Ellsworth Toohey or Howard Rourke finally does make the speech, it summarizes all of the concrete events, all of the concrete personalities they've come to know in the course of the novel.
She really does that work for you. It's masterful. Gerard says in the chat, I'm an artist, and her concrete style really suggests amazing visual images, very strong and dynamic. It's interesting to read passages where she'll talk about the green of trees and the light and the way the light, and right. She takes something very concrete, adds it up to a feeling and a state of mind of the character that she wants you to experience. And it's interesting to listen to.
Boy on the bike, or Dagny in the valley. Yeah. Just the way she vividly describes those moments in the concretes. She's emotionally like only a great poet. I know it's not poetry, a poem's a poem, but there's a poetic element to her writing. She'll give you these elegant, some beautiful, sometimes frightening, sometimes mysterious concretes, and leave you with that emotional cast like only a great poet can. And then when she summarizes it with her abstraction, it gives meaning to all that emotion, to all those concretes. Absolutely correct. One of the great examples, she'll find that telling concrete. You can't look at that concrete without thinking, without that one concrete. All she'll do in the first, this isn't a spoiler because it's the first page of Atlas Shrugged, so it's not too much of a spoiler. Eddie Willers is confronted with a panhandler on the streets of New York. And yet when he looks at the panhandler, when the light changes, he notices that the bum's eyes are intelligent. Whoa. So here you have a kind of a paradox described in perfectly concrete terms. This guy's he needs money. He's panhandling for dimes on the street. And on the other hand, he's got intelligent eyes. That's disturbing. It's disturbing to think, well, why is a smart guy reduced to begging? And so that concrete creates in itself, she hasn't told you anything else. She's just told you about that there's a panhandler with intelligent eyes. And that concrete in itself starts you thinking and starts evoking the entire theme of Atlas Shrugged in one little concrete she drops at the very beginning. This is the power of an artist, to find that telling concrete that can unite abstraction with the concrete. She has a power of doing that with every little thing she does, whether it's a telephone, a airplane, a trip across a bridge on a railroad, or a bracelet, we were talking before it began. In Atlas Shrugged, this may be a little bit of a spoiler, but I don't think too much of one. There's a bracelet that Hank Rearden, one of the great geniuses she describes in Atlas Shrugged, he's just invented this amazing new metal, lighter and stronger than steel. He's so proud. It's his life's achievement. And so he wants to bring home his wife the first thing he casts with it, a bracelet. And so it's in the form of a chain. And of course, his wife, who's totally a parasite, like the rest of his family on him, ironically says, this is the chain by which he holds us in custody. Well, in a later scene at a party, Dagny Taggart, the heroine of the novel, has an expensive diamond bracelet on. It gave her the sense, the most feminine sense, Ayn Rand said, a woman chained, right? Interesting thought right there. But Dagny is willing to exchange that. Lillian is dismissing it. Oh, well, this old thing, I'd change it for any diamond bracelet any day. Dagny takes her up on it immediately, realizing that the symbolic value of this is way more valuable than any diamond bracelet. And she takes it, and now she has the chain. How important is that? Dagny Taggart is still chained to the world by her love of achievement. And so in the hands of Lillian, in the hands of Rearden, in the hands of Dagny, that simple concrete takes on different abstract meanings as we come to understand the characters, and it's all given to us right there with the use of one concrete. Just amazing.
Extraordinary. It's interesting that you said, well, Ayn Rand's writing isn't poetry, but Anthem is practically a prose
Yeah,
poem.
yeah,
And
that's the closest.
there are so many sequences in Ayn Rand's writing that are just magnificent to read out loud the way that good poetry should be read.
Right,
The biggest challenge I run into is there are some that I can't read without getting too choked up.
right.
You mentioned part 4 of The Fountainhead, the opening of chapter 1, the boy on the bicycle. One that comes to mind for me, minor spoiler, but not a big plot spoiler, is Dagny Taggart has gotten together with Hank Rearden. There's things going on in the nation that Francisco d'Anconia, her former lover, he's trying to convince her to join this group of people, to walk away from her job. A big crisis happens, splits them up. He finally tracks her down in New York, goes to her apartment. They're having a discussion. The door lock makes a sound. The door opens. Hank Rearden walks in and casually slips a key to her apartment into his pocket. The way that she builds up this sequence of events is magnificent, but especially because she doesn't tell you Hank thought this, Dagny thought that, Francisco felt this way. She gives you all of the concrete. She sets up the situation. And by the time Hank Rearden slaps Francisco d'Anconia across the face, and that's not even the big moment. The big moment is when Dagny is ready to lash out at Hank.
Hank.
And what does Francisco say? Don't. And she has to obey that. And why does she have to obey that? She could have, no, she couldn't. The way that Ayn Rand sets it up, again, from the concretes to the abstractions, everything she built up in the plot of the story up to this point, she pays the freight. She gives you a scene I can't even read from start to finish without tearing up.
Tearing up.
Magnificent.
Magnificent. Magnificent. And that scene in particular is filled with all kinds of unexpected paradox for a romantic triangle confrontation scene. In most romantic novels, when a romantic triangle has a confrontation, it is going to be just the opposite. Ayn Rand presents us in that scene philosophically with such weight about values, her philosophy, the way she approaches the different psychologies of the characters, the way she approaches that, and yet it is described in purely concrete terms, and yet leaves the reader with absolutely no ambiguity as to precisely the intellectual, the abstract, and the emotional quality of that moment. You feel this tension, this incredible tension, and it's resolved in a way. All I can do, if you haven't read Atlas Shrugged, is you will walk away from that thinking, I have never read a romantic triangle confrontation scene written like that ever.
One of the themes that comes out reading the early stories in the early Ayn Rand, a bit of a spoiler for one of the plays, but Ayn Rand makes the point that she rarely ever gives the villains in her story the central action in the story. And in the triangle we're talking about, you might guess, not even having read the book, well, Dagny's in love with Hank, but maybe she's still in love with Francisco. Well, maybe they're both still, but the amazing part of that is how much the men love each other and they hate each other. But they're more than brothers. They're just, it kills Hank to have done what he did.
Right. It's just utterly, it's so difficult for all of them. You feel the anguish of that moment, like, again, and she describes it in purely simple, concrete terms, and you can't walk away shaken by the emotion of it. You're absolutely right.
And what is the conflict? James Taggart, he's important to the plot, but is he important? Who else? Who are the villains who really matter in the story? No. The conflict is not between the villains. It's,
right.
When it comes to the...
Far more interesting is conflict between good people, between heroes, well-intentioned people, smart people. Those are the people that have the interesting conflict as far as she's concerned. These villains are, mostly just, human ballast. Sometimes they'll play, semi-important role. Ellsworth too a little bit plays important roles, but it's really insofar as they're involved in the conflict between a good character and another good character that Ayn Rand is mostly interested.
Yeah, Tui is a significant villain but he never really takes down Rourke.
He can't.
He's part of taking down Winan, but no, the real conflict.
Right.
Dominique Francon, Gail
Exactly.
Winan, Howard Rourke.
And he can only take Gail Winan because Gail Winan never realized that rather than controlling, he was their slave. And so it's only that realization that I was unknown to myself, a thrall to the Ellsworth Tuohys and to his masses. So it's only Gail Winan's own weakness, in effect, that made him so vulnerable to Ellsworth Tuohy. Just exactly. And that's contrasted with Howard Rourke, who doesn't need to really even think about Ellsworth Tuohy at all. Thank you. I'll succeed on my own without even considering you.
Yes.
And so she will draw it out in that way. But that's the most oomph you'll really ever get from a villain from Ayn Rand in terms of effective action.
Yeah. But I don't think of you goes hand in hand with, but we never had to take any of it seriously, did we? The evil is out there, and evil's got to be fought, and it can be a big part of the war, but not important, not essential.
Oh, what a great! This is a terrible spoiler, and I'm going to avoid trying to spoil it. When Dagny first sees Galt, and those who've read the novel know what I mean. Those who don't, you'll just have to read it for yourself. That moment is described in perfectly concrete terms. Yes, we're given some of her evaluations of his face, right? The face without pain or fear or guilt. But everything else is in effect a concrete, but a concrete that we've earned through the course of all the previous pages. We know exactly the importance of this to Dagny Taggart. We know what it means to her, its emotional relevance, how it philosophically connects, and all she's really effectively done is described concretely what has just happened. Her sight of the valley, her sight of this man's face, her physical experience having just gone through what she went through. I won't spoil more. But there's a wonderful example. Or again, the beginning of The Fountainhead. Howard Rourke on the cliff, considering the rocks, the river, what lies ahead of him. Just concrete terms said in just enough of an abstract way to tantalize you. What the heck is ahead of this guy? Because all the world is this latent potential of power before him. Unbelievable what Ayn Rand can do simply with a list of concrete specifics in the world around and evoke the abstract, evoke the evaluative, simply with a description of a physical concrete.
Yeah, there's a connection I make between, and I think Ayn Rand is bringing this out in these scenes, both elements of this, both sides of it. It's the same thing, except completely different ends of a scale. There are moments in life, standing naked on a cliff, having put certain challenges behind you and knowing the world is open to you, naked on a cliff, laughing, alone. This magnificent, this is a moment that is an end in itself. This is that feeling. Some people get it from music or get it from dancing. Some people get it, most of us get it from sex, but different occasions in life. It can be with your children. It can be that this moment, this right now.
A moment alone in nature, like Howard Rourke has.
Even a conversation like this moment is a moment in itself. This is worth doing for its own sake. If I die tomorrow, as long as there were moments like this. But that's the connection is, and what Ayn Rand gives so many of us is the sense that this life, that I am an end in myself. My life is an end in itself. And that's what her work does for me when I see scenes like landing in the valley or standing on the cliff. This moment, this is what all of life should be. The sense of there's lots of struggle, and I want there to be struggle because I want to achieve great things, and it's not always going to be easy, but this life is an end in itself. And I think you only get that, not just through Ayn Rand's philosophy, but it comes out of that literary style of starting with the concretes, starting with the moment, with the reality of things, and building it up to our highest abstractions.
Well, see, that's it. Howard Rourke is thinking about all that lays ahead for him, and all of that is set aside for the concrete reality of this moment, and yet all of that concrete reality is the implications for what he's thinking. There's a great scene connecting the abstract and the concrete. Really, it is. or the entire opening sequence of Atlas Shrugged. I've not Lisa Van Dam, but I have read a lot of novels, and I have never read a novel with a more evocative, with a more powerful setting of emotional mood and concrete expression of the theme to come than in the opening sequence of Atlas Shrugged. It is hauntingly powerful. That entire sequence sets the emotional agenda for that novel just by describing this guy, Eddie Willer's walk. He looks at shops that are closed or buildings that look like the colors of a faded manuscript, and yet he'll see the competence of a bus turning that'll give him reassurance just in the confidence of that. Then he's thinking about what he has ahead, like Howard Rourke, what lies ahead for him. So you know that she's telling you there's some connection between these concretes and what you're going to read about later on here. She doesn't fully tell you, but she gets you all excited by telling you implicitly certain connections here, and more than that. In both cases of the openings of those novels, she fully sets the theme and the emotional agenda, the mood for the entire thing. She can do both, the abstract theme and the emotional cast, conveyed through certain telling concretes that set up the entire thing. I know of no other author who had that kind of power.
It is magnificent. Christopher in the chat says, got integration? It is, because there are other writers who will say at the very outset of their novel, welcome to my world, but they do it with, witches or rocket ships or
even best of times, worst of times. Or, actually one of my favorites is the beginning of Gone with the Wind. Scarlett O'Hara was not a beautiful woman. Boom! Starts out with a paradox like that. Now I'm interested because she's this sex pot who's charming everyone around her. So how does that happen? So it gets you thinking about the character of Scarlett O'Hara. That's effective.
Well, when Ayn Rand says, welcome to my world.
Amateur compared to Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand does that times 100.
You don't get a welcome to my world feeling from Ayn Rand. You just get welcome to the world. And this is going to be worth going through.
Right.
Love that.
Ayn Rand is not, like you said, Ayn Rand's not telling you how to think. It's almost as though she's laying out a test for you, an introspective test. How will you react to this? One of her successfully produced Broadway play in the 1930s, The Night of January 16th, she intentionally constructed the first play in history that had two alternative endings. It's a courtroom drama. And she wrote an ending, and the jury was picked every night from the audience. And so she wrote two different endings, depending on how the jury found her heroine, guilty or not guilty. And so for her, in effect, you almost get that sense with all of her writing. Your character is I'm asking you to look at yourself. I'm asking you to tell me what you think of Dagny, what you think of Hank, what you think of James. It's really about you. I'm just presenting facts. And she presents it that way. It says, oh yeah, I've seen that before. Yeah, I've met someone like that before. Yeah, this is concrete reality of 20th century America that I live in. And yet, the way she puts it together is a challenge, a paradox, a question, a mystery. So that you're asking yourself, what do I think of Howard Rourke? What do I think of Dagny Taggart versus James Taggart? It's a test for you, the reader. It's not a writer telling you, this is what you got to think, and if you're sensitive or intelligent, you're going to agree with me. No.
Yes. And what's great about that, too, anybody who thinks Ayn Rand wrote in a propagandistic way or a simplistic way, the Broadway run of that play was, she loaded the dice. Obviously, it was her fault. No, a third of the time, Karen Andre was voted guilty. This really did depend on the spirit, the sense of life, the soul of the people in that jury. So magnificent. I have to take a moment to say thank you for the super chat to Jamie Hernandez. It's 499 Mexican pesos, so it may be Jaime Hernandez. My Spanish is terrible. I apologize for that, but Jamie Hernandez is in for 499 Mexican pesos, between $20 and $25, which is very much appreciated. Goes to support the Ayn Rand Center UK. We'll put a link in the chat If you're not already a member, you need to be a member of ARCUK. And for $5.99 pounds a month, you can do that. At the silver level, there are 4 different levels with different perks. Any one of those levels will get you talking to this guy, James Valliant, Sunday mornings, extensive study groups. You'll also have access to Don Watkins' communication boot camps Thursdays afternoon. We've talked about it before. We'll talk about it again. You need to be a member of ARCUK. So the link is there in the chat. But Jamie, thank you very much for that.
Muchas gracias, Jaime. Yeah,
I'm sure your pronunciation is, I know how to pronounce a J, but just Jamie, Jaime. I'm sure you've got it. Jaime.
Probably Jaime.
You've got it better than me. Either way, very much appreciated. And yeah, he did give you the icon that says you are amazing, and that's absolutely true.
You are too, Jaime.
Absolutely. I just had one more thing that I absolutely had to say. I'm looking through my notes here. Well, maybe I should let you go on because I can't read my own writing here. But I'm especially loving the connection again to last week's discussion. And synthetic, boy, that complex philosophy. And the fact that, well, but that's why philosophy was easier for Ayn Rand than fiction, because by the time she got to the nonfiction.
No question. But you see, you've got writers like, and to fill that out, Leonard here in the essay makes it really clear. You've got all kinds of writers who are these dry, factual, it makes it simple and plain. I mean, I don't want to insult anyone, Ernest Hemingway, but take Sinclair Lewis or something. It comes out to sort of a dry laundry list of what just happens to be real. There are other writers whose style, maybe more like Thomas Wolfe, who are full of these evaluations and all these adjectives, and a description of New York City for him is really just emotion language filled in there without giving you the concretes that might justify it.
Yeah, unless you already agree with him, you'll just shrug it off.
And so in one sense, and it's not to say that both factors aren't always operative, because they're always operative in a reader. But what's sad is that they sort of divide your consciousness, where there's facts over here and abstractions and values over here. And we can't really blend the two. Ayn Rand can blend the two in a way. For her, it's not, you can extract from Tolkien maybe some wonderful moral about friendship and loyalty and the need to stick in there when things are bad, but you have to translate it from this world of magic and elves and dragons into the real world. With these naturalist writers who, you can read Tolstoy or something, Anna Karenina. Sure, you can be moved by some description, but Tolstoy's never going to let Anna have a way out. She's trapped by fate. Or I was mentioning before, John Steinbeck, a brilliant American, one of the greatest American novelists. He can even have a hero make a kind of a value speech at the end. But are you at the end of the day given any kind of uplift, hope, or meaning to the suffering of the Okies as they travel to California in Grapes of Wrath? No. This is a false alternative in literature. And that's why romantic realism is really the best way to describe Ayn Rand's very unique literary style. She'll never be satisfied with a concrete description unless there's a latent abstract meaning and purpose to it. She won't describe something in an abstract way unless she's already given you 100 concretes through which to see it. And she'll still probably put it in a concrete form for you to see it again even then. This marriage of abstract and particular, universal and particular, concrete and abstract and conceptual, value and fact, all of that blended magically in Ayn Rand's writing is unlike any literary experience you will ever have. Promise.
Outstanding. Well, the only thing I would say in conclusion is if you haven't read the early Ayn Rand yet, it really is a gift. To those of us who have read the 4 novels many times and thought, I wish there was more Ayn Rand to read. If you've never read the early Ayn Rand, there is more Ayn Rand to read. The provisos are in there. Leonard explains in great detail. These are early stories. Many of them weren't intended to be published. I love when he talks about the Fountainhead. He says these scenes, he wasn't originally going to publish them. He doesn't want them to take away from the book, but they're too good. They're too valuable. And then he says they're offered as an individual, self-contained pieces to be read as such. If I may state the point paradoxically for emphasis, These events did not happen to Rourke. They are pure fiction.
We all know about the reality of Rourke.
Yes,
This is the
yes.
fiction. This is fiction about Rourke. This is speculation about Rourke. I love that.
Howard Rourke is more real than a lot of the people I read about in the newspaper.
Exactly. He's certainly more human than most of the people I meet. But you remind me of something really powerful there. Maybe this is a good way of looking at it too. Ayn Rand was, in her own mind, still thinking about fiction writing, even after Atlas Shrugged. Obviously, her magnum opus. She completed really what she wanted to complete in literature, but she still loved fiction. And in her last projected idea for a story or a novel, it really wasn't going to handle any of the big metaphysical or psychological or political themes that she'd been handling in her previous novels. It was going to be about just how life is what it's all about. And there's, no heavy theme she was thinking about putting in there. Just the theme that life is a joy in itself. It connects to one of the short stories, Good Copy, that you'll read in the early Ayn Rand. At one point, in her fiction writing course, she had her students read Good Copy, a lighthearted, fun-loving, O. Henry type story. She really loved O. Henry. O. Henry type story. It didn't have a heavy philosophical theme, and yet she gave it as an example to her fiction writing course. And some people were astonished to learn, very astonished to learn, that Ayn Rand herself had written it precisely because it didn't have some big philosophical theme. And I would say, oh no, it's got the biggest theme of all. Is life worth living? Right? Is this life actually worth living? Wow. So whether it was a complex philosophical theme or simply an assertion about the benevolent universe or her sense of life, Ayn Rand's technique does not change. It's through the concretes and through contemplating the concretes sort of as an end in itself. We're talking about the metaphysical experience of Howard Rourke on the cliff. For her, every work of fiction is meant to be such a metaphysical experience. And whether you're learning something like in Atlas Shrugged about the role of the mind in human existence and survival, the theme of Atlas Shrugged, or whether you're just simply learning what a joy it is to live this wonderful life and how positive life can be. However abstract it is, Ayn Rand is getting at it literarily by the same means, by finding the telling concretes that will elegantly nudge you right to where she wants you to be. There's no writer like Ayn Rand.
I couldn't agree more. An outstanding place to end. Thank you so much, James. I enjoyed reading the essay, but I always get more out of it after having the discussion with you. I hope everybody who's listening feels the same way. I'm sure they do. It makes me eager to hear the discussion we're going to have next Friday on Leonard Peikoff's essays. Thank you so much, James Valliant.
Well, thank you, Mr. Nasir. You're the best.